Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is Jing, Cultivating Stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. This is because any meeting between Daoists always involves the Tao. The Tao is always present in some respect, remembering the sacred, maintaining sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes a formal talk and more open discussion. For these meetings, I want to talk about some foundational topics that may be of more general interest. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So for this Lundao, I want to discuss Daoist View with a specific focus on foundational Daoist concerns, commitments, principles, qualities, and values. So Daoist View, here we have Dao Jian, so literally seeing with or through the Tao. So this would be the approximation of Daoist View in Chinese, and I'll talk about what I mean by view in a moment. But Jian can also be pronounced Xian and mean to appear or to manifest. So the way that the Tao manifests might be a secondary meaning of this phrase. Taoists historically have also referred to this as Daoyan, literally Tao vision, which kind of sounds like a superpower, but the ability to kind of see and perceive through the Tao, with the Tao. We also find the character Jing, that means landscape or scenery, sometimes more technically effulgences, but this character appears in the Huangting Jing titles, the scripture on the yellow court, as view. So the Wai Jing, the external view, and the Nei Jing, the internal view. So thinking about a Taoist viewpoint, a Taoist perspective, including various views within that. So thinking about view involves particular perspectives. So as a contemplative exercise, what are we looking at here? And I don't just mean in the general sense. I mean, what are you looking at? What particular things are catching your attention? What are you perceiving here? So in general, we're thinking about how Taoists view the world, the kind of Taoist perspective informed by Taoist values. As I mentioned in the previous Lundao on the Taoist tradition, there is no orthodoxy or heterodoxy in Taoism, especially considered as a whole. So this idea of correct or true belief and false belief, so this kind of dogmatic idea or rigid doctrinal views, is not Taoist, and fundamentally I would say is un-Taoist or anti-Taoist. So you might say there's an orthodoxy of non-orthodoxy. So we're cultivating the Tao and finding our own insights and our own perspectives, obviously informed by the tradition. Taoists also emphasize non-knowing, so open receptivity. So this idea that we're always viewing things through our own limited perspective. So we might need multiple perspectives to really understand something. Also attentiveness and expansiveness. So here, as we look at this landscape, what landforms are we looking at? Do we have a sense of the contour lines? What is our location? What is our perspective? But vision actually is only sometimes emphasized in Taoism. Right? If you look at the Taoist tradition more generally, and especially in terms of classical Taoism and foundational Taoist views, quote unquote, it's much more about listening. So here we have a number of important Taoist terms related to our topic for today. So view, but view beyond vision. So awakening to the Tao. There's some kind of consciousness, awareness of something beyond the merely perceptual in the sense of vision, Wu Dao. Also, Taoists tend to emphasize guidance. So here, guidance is translating Zhinan, that literally means pointing south. So yes, it's another kind of orienteering analogy, a map and compass, or at least directional sense. So what direction are we facing? What direction are we headed? Do we have the correct orientation, which I'll talk about in a moment. Life destiny, so Ming. So sometimes this is translated as fate. It can also mean, I think more liberally, something like our own life path. It relates to vocation. So what is it that we need to do to manifest our own sense of aliveness? And why this is here in the sense of beyond vision is to point towards a larger kind of matrix of being that's directing us, that we can listen to. And that relates to listening to qi, so ting qi. This is in the Zhuangzi, when the Zhuangzi is talking about this important apophatic practice of xin jai, the fasting of the heart-mind, that I'll talk about later in another Lundao. But here it's this energetic perception, something larger than the kind of visual panorama of our experience. So it's oftentimes discussed as more auditory, but beyond even kind of perceptual listening. It's a different kind of listening, a subtle listening, an energetic listening. In the Tao Te Ching, you also find reference to Xuan De, mysterious inner power, and mysterious perception, Xuan Lan. So the Lan character here has Jian in it that we started with, to perceive. But it also connects to Jian, mirror. So a mysterious mirror, reflection back on things, or reflection through things. And so the point here is that there's a way of perceiving that's beyond kind of ordinary sensory perception, that is mysterious. So if you saw the first Lundao that I gave about the Taoist tradition, Xuan, mystery or mysterious, is another non-name or non-description for the Tao. So being infused by the Tao, having a different way of experiencing and being in the world. We tend to talk about the three orientations. So the San Fang. The three orientations are view. So that's what I started with, talking about perception. So Kanfa, literally a way, a method of perceiving. Practice, so Shoulian. So Shoulian is a technical Taoist term that literally means cultivation and refinement. If we think through these technical terms, these characters, a lot of times there's the association of Xiu Dao, cultivating the Tao, and Lian Dan, refining the elixir. So there's some kind of cultivation, and there's also a refinement process, and that is Taoist practice. So practice doesn't exactly capture the fullness of that phrase, Shoulian. And then experience, so Zhengyan. So Zhengyan more technically means experiential confirmation or signs of success or something like that. So it has this idea of practice leading to fruition. So these are interrelated, right? View informs practice, informs experience, but practice has a kind of view embedded in it and leads to a certain set of experiences. And those experiences come from the view and the practice. So these are interrelated. One thing here, since we're talking more about view, is to think about it in terms of worldview. So worldview is a reverse translation in the sense of Shiguan. That's a reverse translation from the English worldview via German. So the view is a way of perceiving a way of seeing, and also a particular way of observing the world. And there's obviously a Daoist view and a series of views related to that. This connects to Daoist commitments, principles, qualities, and values, which I'll talk about below. But the key point here is that it's possible to practice certain kinds of methods without the informing view that will lead to different types of experiences. So the view is essential. These are interrelated, but we really need a view in order to go deeper into the practice and the experience of Taoism. This relates to orientation, so fang xiang. And so I have a compass here. And I don't know how much you know about map and compass or orienteering or how much backpacking or mountaineering you've done. But what this is telling us we're trying to orient ourselves towards true north in relationship to magnetic north. So the relationship between the map and compass to the larger landscape. And this usually involves, depending on where you are, some kind of declination. So you actually have to set a compass in order to have the appropriate orientation. So one way of thinking about this as an analogy is the Tao is true north. And Taoism, this kind of Daoist view, is the declination setting. So it's what's going to allow us to actually reach the Tao in a more efficacious and effective way. This also relates to virtue, which I'll talk about below, but fang xiang, having this orientation, is rooted in a kind of ethical approach, an ethical orientation that helps maintain this path back towards the Tao. So the Tao as a cosmological and theological category, if you watched the first Lundao that I gave on the Taoist tradition, we talked about this a fair amount. But there are four primary characteristics of the Tao as a Taoist cosmological and theological category that is about the universe and about the sacred. So the source of everything, an unnameable mystery, an all-pervading sacred presence, and the universe as transformative process. So everything comes from the Tao, everything is a manifestation of the Tao. We are connected to the Tao inherently, originally, right? And this is ongoing. So even if it seems this isn't the case, it is from a Taoist perspective. It's a mystery, so it's beyond human knowing, it's beyond human language. So the Tao is just a placeholder for the sacred, for what's ultimately real. And even those are names and categories and conceptions of something that's beyond what we can fully comprehend. So from a Taoist perspective, we can participate in it. So as a sacred presence that's enlivening the world, that's infusing the world and our bodies, we can connect with it directly. And that goes back to the kind of energetic listening, the energetic experiencing, or the mysterious perception that I mentioned before. It's also the universe as a transformative process or nature. And so one thing that's really important to understand here is from a Taoist perspective, the world, nature, our bodies is the Tao on some level. It's not distinct from the Tao. The Tao manifesting through our bodies is a way of experiencing the sacred. That includes physiologically, energetically, and so on. So in technical comparative language, this Taoist theology is monistic, that is one impersonal reality. It's panentheistic, so the sacred in and beyond the world, and it's panenhenic, nature as sacred. So the Tao is not outside of space and time. The Tao is manifesting through everything. But if humans cease to exist, if the earth ceases to exist, if the universe ceases to exist, the Tao doesn't cease to exist. These are just particular manifestations of the Tao. So one really important aspect of Taoist view is the larger cosmology. And again, in technical language, what we're talking about here is cosmogony, actually. So the origins of the universe, not creation. Creation is a particular cosmogony. It's assumed, and when people talk about creation, it's usually coming out of a Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic tradition. So Taoists don't have the view of creation as such. It's more about cosmic emanation and differentiation. So this is from chapter 3, Tianwan, Celestial Patterns of the Huainanzi, the book of the Huainan Masters, finished and submitted to the throne in 139 BCE, oftentimes thought about as the kind of last major composition of classical Taoism. So this is my translation. When the heavens and earth were not yet formed, all was ascending and flying, diving and delving. This was called the grand Inception. The Tao originally produced the nebulous void. The nebulous void produced space-time. Space-time produced original qi. A boundary divided this qi. The clear and light rose to become the heavens. The heavy and turbid sank to become the earth. It is easy for the clear and light to converge, but difficult for the heavy and turbid to coalesce. Thus, the heavens were completed first, while the earth was formed afterward. The conjoined essences of the heavens and earth produced yin and yang. The successive essences of yin and yang caused the 4 seasons. The scattered essences of the 4 seasons birthed the myriad beings. So if you know something about traditional Chinese cosmology and thus Daoist cosmology, you immediately think of yin and yang. And so here we have a discussion of how the heavens and the earth were formed as kind of primordial or original yang and primordial or original yin, and then the interaction of them. And so this is a kind of differentiation of qi into yin and yang. But the key point here is that there's a kind of sequential unfolding of the manifest universe. And if we go back to that Daoist view of the 4 characteristics of the Tao, there's a source. So the source is before this, right? The source is primordial non-differentiation. And then there's a spontaneous change in that starts to manifest through the universe in these differentiated forms. So this relates to the foundational Daoist cosmogony. So technically, Wuji and Wuji are a kind of later Taoist way of talking about this compared to the Huainanzi, the book of the Huainan Masters that we were just looking at. But it's still helpful here for trying to understand the kind of foundational Taoist cosmogony and cosmology. So there was an unrepresentable before. So this is even before the Taoist source. Then there is the one, Wuji, primordial undifferentiation or non-differentiation. From that, and this is Tao Te Ching chapter 42, right? It splits into yin and yang, the formation of the heavens and the earth that we just saw. And then the interaction of the heavens and the earth of yin and yang, producing the 3, or Taiji, the great ultimate yin and yang interaction. And then from that, producing the 5 phases, including the 4 seasons that we saw before. This way of organizing the 5 phases, so water on top, fire below, metal to the west, wood to the east, and earth in the center, is the more primordial kind of early differentiation of these phases, or sometimes they're talked about as elements. So if we're looking at the top, which is technically north here, water is major yin, fire is major yang, metal is minor yin, wood is minor yang. So we can talk about the 5 phases in terms of yin and yang differentiation and yin and yang interaction. And so the key point here in terms of the foundational Taoist view of how the universe came to be is there was a spontaneous transformation. And you can see on the right, this is an impersonal process. There is no agency or intentionality here. So in a certain way, the relationality is purely our own. It's our resonance with the larger pattern that creates the sense of relationality. So the Tao as such is not conscious. It manifests through consciousness, but it isn't conscious in and of itself. So from this perspective, there's a movement from this primordial unity into a kind of formation of the heavens and earth. And this is what I mentioned before, the panentheistic and the panenhenic. So manifesting through the universe, manifesting through the world, manifesting through nature, and in a certain way, the universe and nature being the Tao. So there is a distinction to be made, but much less so than other traditions. So this isn't dualism, it's also not transcendentalism. In a certain way, it's much more of an immanence-based cosmology or theology. and then emanating, differentiating further. So still an impersonal process, but manifesting through and into things that are personal. So from a traditional Taoist perspective, that would even include God, spirits, ghosts, things like that. So this this polytheistic viewpoint. So many personal gods in the universe. But they're not primordial in the sense of outside of space and time. They can be closer to the origins of the universe, but ultimately they're impermanent, they're ephemeral. And this includes all beings, so into the myriad beings. So if you've read the Tao Te Ching, it talks about the Wang Wu, the 10,000 things, or the 10,000 beings. And so all of that is a manifestation of this, including ourselves. So this is expansion without diminishment, the Tao present from beginning to end and throughout. And I think one thing that's really profound in Taoism that's helpful for our own practice and maybe as a necessary antidote to a lot of the limitations of modernity is that the Tao is manifesting in as through our own being. So organic embodied being in the world is something positive. In a certain sense, it's sacred from a Taoist perspective. And this relates to qi. So everything is qi on some level, right? From the most substantial, so rocks, for example, to the most subtle, so spirit or even gods, for example. And in this energetic viewpoint, it's beyond body and mind. So a lot of times in the modern world, you have people talking about mind-body dualism or mind-body holism. But this is actually a qi-based worldview, an energetic view. So it bridges the potential gaps between these things that we tend to identify as, oh, this is material in nature, that would be the body, and this is like immaterial, quote unquote, in nature, or more subtle, that's consciousness. And obviously that's complex in terms of the relationship between brain and consciousness or contemporary neuroscience and these kinds of things. But the point here is that everything is qi. So these practices are rooted in an energetic view and they activate a kind of subtle body. And so here the etymology is helpful. The upper part is qi, that means steam or vapor. And the bottom part is mi, so rice, and especially like a rice kernel, grain of rice. And so one idea here on an etymological level is that qi is analogous to the steam that comes from cooking rice. Right, so it's something subtle. We generally don't translate it in English anymore. We just refer to it as qi, just like we talk about the Tao or yin and yang. Sometimes it's translated as subtle breath or vital breath. Sometimes it's translated somewhat problematically or anachronistically as energy, but that might be fairly close to what it actually refers to. And then in a kind of confusing way as pneuma through the Greek. So that just adds a whole nother set of problems. So I prefer just not translating it, leaving it as qi. There are these intersecting fields of energy. So there's the energetic field of our body, the energetic field of place, the energetic field of other people and relationships, the energetic field of the world, and so on. And so there's a way to kind of understand the Tao as this complete, integrated, unified energetic field that consists of all these other individual energetic fields that are intersecting and interpenetrating. So from this perspective, there's interrelationship, there's permeability, and there's circulation patterns. So we can open up our bodies in such a way where we can be more attuned and sensitive to this energetic aliveness, this way of energetic listening that shows that these are kind of mutually infusing experiences of qi. So although there are a lot of different types of qi, and I'm not going to get into that in this talk, that's related to other issues, but one part of the Daoist view is qi-based, so energetic. But another part is to understand these types of qi and that Dao qi, the qi of the Tao or Wei energy, is the primary form of qi that Taoists are most interested in. So this relates to more non-differentiation, formlessness, right? Non-things like that. So from a Taoist perspective, if we think about that traditional cosmogony, the way the universe came to be, this Tao Qi is closer to the source, closer to the origin. So sometimes it is talked about as Yuan Qi original or primordial qi. But that gets somewhat complicated because yuan qi gets used in different ways in different contexts. So here we have the Dao character that we've encountered before. And then the second character is the esoteric Taoist character for qi. So in the previous slide, we saw qi in the ordinary way that it's written, so steam above rice. Here we have ji, collect, above huo, fire, the huo fire radical. So there's one way of thinking about this more literally in terms of the received character as the collection of heat, right, or a subtle warmth in the body. But there's also a Taoist esoteric reading of this character. So one thing we talk about is Daoist etymology. And Daoist etymology is about the way that Taoists sometimes read the characters or apply the characters, or the way in which the characters, what the characters tell us from an applied, lived, practice-based perspective. So one way of reading this character is that it's Wu, so the kind of simplified version of Wu in the sense of non-being or free of or without. And then the single vertical stroke is either the vertical connection with the Tao or E, one, the unity with the Tao. So the connection or unity of non-being manifesting as a subtle warmth in and through the body. And this is a common experience that people have with qi, that yes, you can feel it like a subtle current, but you can also feel it as warmth within the body. So in terms of a foundational Daoist view, one of the key things, and this relates to the earlier discussion about tradition, is the three treasures, and specifically the external three treasures, the Wai Sambao. So the Tao, which we've been talking about a lot, the Wei, Jing, scriptures, and Shi, teachers. So in that order, this is like absolutely essential. The Tao is the first external treasure. It's the most important. The Tao, from a Taoist perspective, manifests in and through the Jing. So this is a particular type of Taoist literature. Sacred texts, I prefer to translate it as scriptures. Sometimes it's translated as classics, but that doesn't exactly capture the sacred standing of these particular kinds of texts. So the Tao De Jing, right? That's the later honorific name of the Lao Tzu. The Zhuangzi as the Nanhua Jing, the scripture of Nanhua or southern fluorescence, and so on. And then there are many Taoist scriptures, and they vary according to the Taoist movement or sub-tradition usually. But that would be the next most important aspect of the tradition. And then the Shi. So the Shi, the teachers, can refer to a lot of things. It can refer to community elders. It can refer to formal teachers. It obviously refers to ordained Taoist priests and monastics, but it also can refer to the community as a whole. And ideally, why this matters is that it's all manifesting the Tao. So obviously the Tao itself, but the way in which the scriptures help align us with the Tao and help us understand what the Tao is. And then ideally, the teachers are infused with the Tao and informed by the scriptures. So this is really important from our perspective. That is, scripture study helps us gain a more informed and nuanced understanding of Taoism. So again, we can think about this in terms of non-differentiation, formlessness, and numinosity, the way in which these are manifesting in the world. What are the containers for them? So the Tao itself is a container of that because it's just a name. So it's trying to actually hold some kind of larger reality, the sacred. The scriptures also are ideally that kind of receptacle of that numinous presence. And then obviously, ideally, the teachers as well. So when we think of a Daoist view, one key concept is shou, usually translated as to cultivate or cultivation, right? And it can also mean to mend. So you have these really important Taoist phrases: shou Dao, cultivating the Tao; shou Lian, cultivation and refinement, which I mentioned before in terms of practice; shou Xing, so literally cultivate and practice. So a lot of times this is a kind of more general phrase for practice. And when we think of Xiu in this way as cultivation, it's an agriculture and animal husbandry analogy, right? So what are we actually cultivating? So we can say, oh, we're cultivating the Tao. But then in the midst of that, what kinds of qualities, what kinds of states are we cultivating? So that is a contemplative inquiry for all of us, that fundamental question from a Taoist perspective of what are we cultivating? What am I cultivating? What are you cultivating? And in this perspective, in this viewpoint, everyone is cultivating something. It's just that most people don't know what it is. So as Taoists, we are committed to awareness and intentionality in practice. When we apply this cultivation framework, this cultivation model or lens to our lives, to our practice, we start to think about it in this larger analogical or metaphorical way. So we can think about our practice, we can think about our lives seasonally, right? So we begin by planting something, we tend that. At some point that comes to fruition, we harvest it, and then if we have surplus, we store it. And we can use this to just think about the larger life pattern, that in our youth we plant things. As we move into maturity and adulthood, we tend to things. As we ideally, if we're fortunate, move into old age, we start to harvest. And then there's this kind of storing process in preparation for another transformation. And in this viewpoint, then we can think about our own practice. So if we think about our practice in terms of a cultivation cycle, we are planting something. What are we planting? Then we tend those things. If we do this in an intentional way, then we will see fruition. We will be able to harvest and store it. And so even though it tends to be viewed sequentially, right, we can also think of this in terms of our daily life and moments, right? So just because we're in a larger cultivation cycle in terms of Taoist practice, that doesn't necessarily mean that overlaps or directly intersects with the daily life experiences that we're having, or maybe the challenges. So there might be a certain situation we're in where we have to then be much more attentive to what's being planted there. It might be us planting it, it might be someone else planting it, it might be a collective undertaking, and so on. So there's a way to use this as a framework for kind of understanding anything that we're doing in our lives. A foundational Daoist view also relates to innate nature, or Xing. This character consists of Xin on the left side and Sheng on the right side. Xin is heart-mind, and Sheng is to be born. So from a Taoist etymological perspective, this is the heart-mind we were born with. It is our original and inherent connection with the Tao. If we put this into a larger Taoist view, what I sometimes refer to as Taoist contemplative psychology, it relates to Xin itself, the heart-mind, but especially original heart-mind. So for instance, the Neya inward training tells us within the heart-mind, there's yet another heart-mind. So that heart-mind, the original heart-mind, is innate nature. And innate nature, Xing, is also associated with spirit, Shen, especially original spirit, Yuan Shen. So these go together. So we're kind of thinking about the relationship of the dimensions of ourselves. And this is fundamental for Taoist practice, especially if you saw the previous Lundao about the Taoist tradition. I talked about different models. And so one model of Taoism that we use, that's our kind of primary model, is a quietistic view. And that view is that our innate nature, which is Xing on the right, you just saw that character, and Dao on the left, so we've been talking a lot about the Tao, is that our innate nature is the Tao, right? There is a kind of distinction between the two, but ultimately they're one. And what unifies these here is Jing, that's the middle character, so stillness. So the Tao as stillness with an uppercase S is our innate nature as stillness with a lowercase s. But it's all one single stillness, right? So through cultivation, specifically through quietistic meditation, we're returning to our fundamental nature, the ground of our being, which is stillness, which is the Tao, connects us to the Tao. So we also talk about establishing the foundations, Juji. And this is a contemplative inquiry, right? So what is the foundation of our lives? What kind of foundation do we have? What kind of foundation are we trying to build? So from a Taoist perspective, what we're doing right now is establishing the foundations. Maybe you already know some of the things I'm talking about, but maybe you don't. But the view is one of the foundations. So in the process of doing this particular inquiry, we are establishing one of the foundations. But establishing the foundations oftentimes has the technical meaning of virtue, including beneficial deeds. So how do we start to establish a root in practice to continue on with that agricultural metaphor or that organic metaphor? And how do we establish that root? We establish that root by tending to our fundamental wellness, our fundamental goodness, this virtue that is what we are. And so from this Taoist perspective, one thing that we can do to better attune ourselves with the Tao and have this deeper sense of energetic aliveness and connection is cultivate what's called hidden merit or hidden virtue, yin gong or yin de. So that is doing certain kinds of activities without anyone knowing it, but activities that are beneficial and transformative for other beings. So not just people, this is important. Taoism tends to be one of the least anthropocentric traditions. So we're not just thinking about being a human among other humans, we're thinking about it in a broader sense in terms of ethics and virtue. So what kinds of things are we doing in our daily lives that help the flourishing and the aliveness of other beings? And the hidden merit or the hidden virtue part is that we do it without an expectation of recompense. We don't expect to be recognized. We don't expect to be acknowledged. We don't expect to receive some kind of response or reward for what we're doing. So much so that it's hidden. People don't even know we're doing it. So you can kind of think about that as a possibility. This also relates to true earth. So if you're picking this up, right, roots, foundations, earth, right, there's this kind of organic thread happening here. And true earth brings our attention to the ground. So in Chinese, it's Zhentu. So the ground, what is the ground of cultivation, right? And Zhen here is interesting because it oftentimes is understood as vessel or a crucible, but also with an alchemical dimension. So it's about some kind of alchemical transmutation. And if we're thinking through this, it is an ingredient to our practice. It has the possibility to infuse our practice and to deepen our practice. So true earth as the ground of cultivation is usually refers to first and foremost honesty. Right? So Xin. So honesty can also be translated, Xin can also be translated as sincerity or trust. But honesty with ourselves, honesty with others. So we won't make progress in our practice if we're not honest about where we are in our lives. So a very simple example of this is there something, is there a deficiency, right, that we need to work on, that you need to work on, that I need to work on? So am I honest with myself about that, right? This is something I need to work on. I'm committed to working on it. I'm not going to pretend like it's not the case, right? And this includes in relationship to other people. So ideally, this honesty is infusing all of our relationships, right? So that's a kind of inquiry for you to look into. But Zhentu can also mean stillness. So there's the honesty layer, which is connected to earth. And then there's also stillness, which is connected to earth, the quality of earth, like we saw in the Huainanzi. So this stillness is the kind of foundation of our practice. It's the view also that's informing our practice. And there's this really interesting line from chapter 49 of the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, that says, I trust those who are trustworthy. I also trust those who are untrustworthy. So at first read, depends on how you tend to think about these things, but at first read, it seems to suggest oh, you should just trust everyone without any discrimination. And that's possible. That might be one way to read it. And especially if we're more in an impersonal, transpersonal state of relating to beings. But on a deeper level, it really means that we can see what people's motivations and our intentions are. We also can recognize what they have access to in the moment. So they're showing us what they are in the moment. That's the trusting the untrustworthy. So if somebody is actually behaving in an unethical way or lacks virtue, the trusting that is that they're showing you something, right? That doesn't mean they fundamentally are that. It just means that's what they're manifesting in the moment. So from a Taoist perspective, this is a practice as well, is seeing beyond that momentary distortion, seeing beyond that momentary dissonance. And beneath that it's still possible for them to connect with their innate nature, to live through the Tao, for honesty to emerge in the midst of that. So we've been talking, it depends, I lay out slides in different ways. So normally you lay out Chinese, traditional Chinese from right to left. So in this case, we're moving from left to right. So the left character is Xing, we just saw that, innate nature. The next character is Pu. I usually translate this as unhewn simplicity. Sometimes it's translated as the uncarved block. De, inner power or virtue, and Wu Wei, non-action. So one of the reasons to put all these characters up here is to have us think about the relationship between these things. So De is the character that usually gets, the third character, it usually gets translated as inner power or virtue in a technical Taoist sense. So it does relate to virtue in the sense of our overall character and conduct, but it's also the way the Tao manifests through embodied being in the world. So when we put this together in terms of the Daoist view, these are all interrelated. So innate nature is unhewn simplicity, is inner power or virtue, is Wu Wei, is non-action. So that stillness component, right? We talked about Jing connected to Xing, innate nature and stillness. So this is a common misunderstanding about Taoism, that Wu Wei is like a kind of philosophical view. Non-action is about some kind of thing that you think about or try to make yourself into. But Wu Wei is actually a contemplative practice. It's a contemplative principle. It's coming out of and informing apophatic and quietistic meditation, that is emptiness and stillness-based meditation. So when we think about this, how do we return to our innate nature? How do we return to our unhewn simplicity? Then how does inner power manifest through us? How do we realize what Wu Wei is and the related phrase of Ziran, suchness? And in this practice-based viewpoint, it's through this practice that is fundamentally about stilling, about returning to stillness, about returning to the ground of our being. So this kind of practice is contentless, non-conceptual, and non-dualistic. In a contemporary modern context, we usually refer to it as quiet sitting, Jing Zuo, and I'll give a different talk on that. But let's just think about this for a moment. So there is no content, right? We are basically moving towards pure consciousness, a contentless state of consciousness. It's non-conceptual, so that's difficult because all of this that we're talking about is conceptual, but ultimately in the actual practice, in the experience of it, we're abandoning concepts. So that includes any concept, the concept of the Tao, the concept of the practice, as for instance, Zuo Wang, sitting in forgetfulness, right? That becomes a filter, that becomes a concept, a construct in itself. It's also non-dualistic, so I mentioned this before. We don't meditate to become still. We don't meditate to align ourselves with the Tao. We meditate because we are returning to stillness, we're returning to the Tao, and ultimately it was always there. It is one single field. So this relates to contemplative being. It's more about ethical, what might be thought of as ethical naturalism or naturalistic morality. We have this original innate wellness and goodness that we're just returning to. So one way to think about this is there's a place inside you where you are always free, connected, and well. And that's really one of the fundamental views of the practice. Right? So anything other than that is only apparently so. Right? If we feel disconnected from the Tao, that's only a momentary sense of distortion or disconnection. Beneath that, the connection is still there. So there's a famous Taoist oral teaching that says human beings may be distant from the Tao, but the Tao is never distant from human beings. So it's only apparently so. Some foundational Taoist principles, there are many. One way to get a foundational Taoist view is to read the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, and the Zhuangs of the Book of Master Zhuang. And then obviously it gets more complicated when we think about the larger tradition. But here we're really talking about foundational Taoist views. So in terms of these principles, this is from chapter 56 of the Tao Te Ching that says, block the passages, close the doorways, blunt the sharpness, untie the knots, harmonize the brightness, unite with dust. So this is obviously open to interpretation. One thing I'll just mention here is that untie the knots is sometimes translated as loosen the tangles. I like both of those translations, so I go back and forth with them. But block the passages, close the doorways. This is usually understood from a more technical practice-based Taoist perspective as disengaging sense perception. So going within and not having the senses be activated. Blunt the sharpness. A lot of times blades and knives and swords are associated with intellect and specifically kind of judgment. So we're not doing that. We're not having a very sharp edge in the way we dissect things or discriminate. In fact, we're trying to blunt that down. So to go more into a state and way of being that's rooted in non-discrimination. So a kind of open awareness. Untying the knots or loosening the tangles is just what it sounds like. But then what this is as a contemplative inquiry is investigating what kinds of knots or tangles we have within ourselves. That could be psychological, that could be relational, certain kinds of habituation patterns or reactions, but also in our larger life. So are there things that are actually creating obstructions, right, that are creating difficulty in our lives that we can untie, that we can loosen? And this might involve, for example, making amends for past wrongs or injuries that we've caused. Harmonizing the brightness. So the brightness being like this possibility of spiritual illumination connected to the heart mind, the original heart mind, and spirit more generally. So through this practice, there's starting to be this more purified consciousness manifesting as numinosity or luminosity, and then that merging into a larger kind of luminous field. And unite with dust. So this is quite interesting because depending on the context or the Taoist movement, sometimes Chun gets translated in a more technical sense as referring to defilements. So you don't want Chun. You want to be free of the dirt. A lot of times that's a Buddhist influence. But here in the Tao Te Ching, they're telling us Tong Chi Chun. So unite with the dust. So what does this mean? That we descend into the acceptance of the ordinary. We don't need to be beyond or above the dust of the world. So that is a participatory view. It's an acceptance. And if you've read the Tao Te Ching, or if you read the Tao Te Ching, you'll find there's a lot of emphasis on being below things, taking the lower position. So that's also connected with the dust. So the dust settling onto the ground and being rooted in the ground in the way that we were talking about before. Some other key Taoist values, principles, and commitments are Bao Pu, embracing simplicity, Chu Su, abandoning the mundane, Gua Yu, decreasing desires, Gui Gun, returning to the roots, Qi Wu, equalizing things, Shou Yi, guarding the one, and Xian Su, appearing plain. So this is obviously fairly complex and would take a lot to unpack. But I just want to kind of bring your attention to a few things here. One is this emphasis on simplicity, on decreasing, on returning. So it's a kind of movement back into the ground of our being, into the kind of foundational experience of being alive. And that is stillness. That is our original inherent connection with the Tao. And so when you start to look at this, there's also a kind of methodology for how to get out of habituation, for how to decondition ourselves. So to kind of let go of desires, let go of mundane concerns, return back to unhewn simplicity, right? Accept things as they are. So that also relates to what I mentioned before about ziran, suchness. So ziran literally means self-so, but I prefer to translate it more technically as suchness. Shoi, guarding the one, is one of the most well-known classical Taoist terms for apophatic and quietistic meditation, this kind of foundational Taoist meditation practice that I'm going to talk about at another Lundao. So guarding the one. So E here is, if you go back to that foundational cosmogony, the Tao as that source, the Tao as that primordial oneness or non-differentiation. And so guard that unity, guard that state of connection and oneness. One thing that's helpful for understanding this is show is the verb. So show is guard, and that's the kind of technical term for meditation in a classical Taoist sense. And then there's a bunch of them. So there's like shou jing, guarding stillness. There's shou zhong, guarding the center, and so on. In this case, E is the Tao, is the one, the Tao as one, the Tao as source. But you can also think of it in other ways. So you can think of it as, yes, the Tao as one, but also the possibility of the process. So unifying with the Tao, recognizing that there is really nothing to unify because we are that. So remember the non-dualism, but also the experience of unity or unification or union. That is, you can think about the one here as the Tao reality, the process, and the experience. And then Xian Su. So people who know Chinese, oftentimes when they are looking at this, they're seeing Jian because that's the standard pronunciation of this character that means to see. So we started with that character. But here it has the pronunciation of Xian, to appear or to manifest. So Xian Su, appearing plane. And so you have these descriptions of the Tao and advanced Taoist apes by extension of they're recognizable by their plainness, by their minimalism, by their blandness. So this obviously goes against kind of dominant values in a contemporary context, but there is this view in Taoism that we're going back to something that's quite pure and something that's quite simple, and maybe something that's nondescript or even bland in the way it manifests. So this can also be connected to what I refer to as Taoist beyond or non-states. This relates to the character Wu, and Wu can literally means without. So it's oftentimes used in the sense of negation, but it also can mean in a more technical sense, absent of or free from something. And so here it's free from potentially negative or harmful qualities or states. So beyond that. So we can think of it as non, we can think of it as lessness, right? So how do we go into these states of that are beyond these ordinary modes of being? So some of these are just some of them, there are many. So Wu Ming, namelessness. So Ming here is quite interesting because Ming, if you were at the other Lundao about the Taoist tradition, can mean like your given personal name. So what your family, the name that your family has given you as your personal name. So it's getting rid of that, being free from that. So being free from the kind of restrictions of social identity or even familial obligations, right? But also not being attached to names in general, like we saw with talking about the Tao. Wu Wei, non-action. Wu Yong, uselessness. Wu Yu, desirelessness. Wu Zheng, non-contention. Wu Zhi, non-knowing. So this connects to various Taoist decrease approaches and practices, including what we saw before, like Gua, decrease, Shao, lessen, Sun, decrease. And one thing that's interesting here when we look at it is, right, how do we free ourselves from becoming used by other people, becoming basically co-opted into these larger projects that aren't necessarily our own? And so one thing that Taoists talk about is being useless or being desireless. So in that open state of consciousness, we can perceive the motivations and the intentions and decide if it's really aligned with our own sense of purpose. Wu Zheng is interesting because this is the end of the Tao Te Ching, right? Talks about the way of the sage or the way of sages is Wu Zheng, is non-contention. So if we read the Tao Te Ching from a Taoist perspective, it culminates with non-contention. And again, thinking about Taoist ternary or three-based numerology and cosmology, the Tao Te Ching is 9 times 1 equals 81. So it is the redoubled or pure yang. It's the culmination of yang. It's the end of that cultivation process, the culmination of some kind of alchemical transformation, even if that's anachronistic. There was no alchemy when the Tao Te Ching was being written. But what I'm trying to get to with this is from that Taoist numerological perspective, when we complete the training mapped out and kind of discussed in the Tao Te Ching, we ideally end in this state, in this approach that's rooted in non-contention. Connecting these things, it's also interesting that in Tao Te Ching chapter 48, it defines Wu Wei, so it defines non-action as twofold decreasing. So Suan Zhi You Suan, right? That is decreasing and again decreasing, which if you recall the Tao Te Ching chapter 1 has a parallel grammatical structure, Xuan Zhi You Xuan, so mysterious and again more mysterious. So through this twofold decreasing, we realize the twofold mystery of the Tao. So these characters are moving from left to right. So Xing Ming, you just saw Xing earlier, Xing Ming, Shuang Xiu, and you saw Xiu earlier. So the dual cultivation, Shuang Xiu, the dual cultivation of innate nature and life destiny, Xing Ming. So one of the reasons to put this here in terms of Daoist view, we've already been talking about how we have this innate nature from a Daoist perspective that is our original inherent connection with the Tao. But that the foundational Daoist view is psychosomatic, actually energetic, but we can talk about it in conventional terms as psychosomatic. So it's about holistic and integrated training. It's about being fully alive as in all these different dimensions of ourselves. So Xing, the first character, innate nature, is connected to Jingong, stillness practice. So this is usually refers to meditation. It's associated with the heart and also spirit. And so we can kind of think about this as mind cultivation. Ming, the second character, which I usually translate more technically as life destiny, is related to Donggong, movement practice. So this is usually referring to Yangsheng or nourishing life practice, health and longevity techniques, but in a modern context, things like Qigong, right? So energy work or Qi exercises. Connected to Shen, the kidneys, and also Jing, vital essence. And then obviously both of these are working with Qi on some level. A lot of the times movement practice is more of a Qi cultivation practice. But we want to be thinking about the relationship of all these different dimensions of ourselves. In any case, Donggong, movement practice, or you might say Minggong, right, life destiny practice, is body cultivation. So what's interesting about this, Xing Ming Shuang Xiu, and Taoists have debated this throughout kind of Taoist history about should you cultivate Xing first, should you cultivate Ming first, should you cultivate them both together, what's the relationship? But one thing that's really interesting is that we can use this to understand practice more generally. So there are certain kinds of practices that are focusing almost only on Xing, almost only on the heart mind. There are some practices that are focusing almost only on Ming, almost only on life destiny, almost only on health and longevity, right? So that would be more of body-based physical kinds of practices. And from a Taoist perspective, we want to do Xing Ming Shuang Xiu, the dual cultivation of innate nature and life destiny. So holistic and integrated Taoist training, even to the point of practice as an all-pervading existential approach. We can think of this as our daily life and as a life way. So life as practice, practice as life, but attending to all these different dimensions of ourselves, all these different dimensions of our lives. And this relates to practice beyond technique. So yes, practice beyond technique. So you can think about how I'm reading this. Am I reading it as an imperative, as an admonition, practice beyond technique? Or am I using it more in a descriptive way of saying there is practice beyond technique? So obviously there are Taoist techniques, but Taoist practice is not reducible to technique. So this is one of the issues going on in the modern world, is you have a lot of teaching of technique without a larger, deeper understanding of what practice is, and especially from a Taoist perspective, Taoist cultivation and refinement, but also the dissemination of Taoist techniques without Taoist view, and also without the informing experience. So this can create all kinds of confusion with people. So when we think about this, we want to really be rooted in what I said before about the holistic and integrated training, right? The practice beyond just the mere kind of method, to think about our life as a whole this way. And so we can understand this in terms of Daoist view as what we refer to as the three expressions, the San Xian: cultivation, embodiment, and transmission. So if we know more about the Taoist tradition, sometimes Taoists will say Xiu Dao. I mentioned that before, cultivating the Tao. They'll say Ti Dao, embodying the Tao. And then they'll say Chuan Dao, transmitting the Tao. So cultivation, embodiment, and transmission. From my perspective, the first two, cultivation and embodiment, are much more about anyone committed to a Taoist path. So we're all cultivating something. We're maintaining a commitment to Taoist cultivation, informed by some of the views I talked about today, doing certain kinds of methods that lead to certain kinds of experiences, and so on. And then we're applying those things. We're attempting to, and ideally not even attempting to, but actually embodying them in the world. And this relates to the earlier points about inner power and virtue. So De as the Tao manifesting through embodied being in the world. And that is embodiment. So yes, the Tao is manifesting through our physicality itself, but through cultivation and refinement, we become more connected to that, more of an embodiment of it, to the point where maybe just being present with people has this kind of transmission. So the way I look at this is cultivation and embodiment are kind of for everyone, and everyone's ideally commitment if they're following a Taoist path. Transmission is more about community elders, right? Ideally spiritual teachers, definitely Taoist priests and Taoist monastics, where that's their or our responsibility to help transmit the tradition, to help transmit the Tao, to help guide people with cultivation and embodiment in their own lives. So thank you for listening to this Taoist Lundao. In the Taoist tradition, we usually say Dao Qi Changcun, so may the Qi of the Tao be forever preserved, and Cibei. So Cibei means compassion, but Taoists often say Cibei to mean thank you. So Cibei, and stay safe and well.